So the Space Pirates has a reputation, and I'm not going to pretend it's not accurate. I don't have much to say about this one. Unlike other boring serials, it's not even one which can be enjoyed ironically, or pointing out silly things about the production. So let's get into this and get through it as quickly as possible before we all die of boredom. So we begin in space with the Space Pirates invading an automated space beacon so they can plant bombs to blow it apart before slowly transporting the sections to their base via rocket. We only have two notable characters in this group, those being Kevin and Dervish, with Kevin being the leader of the group, while Dervish is an engineer who is responsible for dismantling the beacons and then moving them with rockets. There isn't really anything to say about either of them. They feel like they're both barely in it, with neither of them appearing in episode 2, which happens to be the only existing one. They do get some somewhat entertaining dialogue, as Dervish tends to want to not do anything and feels like he's being peer pressured into it, although the serial doesn't go into this admittedly interesting idea. I was actually hoping that Dervish was going to betray Kevin by the end, but he doesn't and ends up sticking with him right to the end, even when he's being pushed far out of his comfort zone. Next we have the V-ship and its crew. So we really only have two notable characters again, those being General Hermack, who is the commander of the ship, and his second in command, Major Warren. Like with the pirates, there isn't too much to say about either of them. Hermack does have a history with character Milo Clancy. The two of them spend most of their time discussing the space pirates and guessing what they might do, and where they could possibly be, drawing a lot of conclusions which turn out to be wrong until the last minute when they figure out the truth. But this means that they don't really feel that important despite being more important in the serial than the leads. The V-ship basically spends the serial running around going from planet to planet or to the space beacons, which means we end up waiting for some big development to happen with them. It's perhaps the most running around that's happened in the show so far. Now on to Madeline Izagiri, the owner of the Izagiri Mining Company. She shows up in the earlier parts just to be around and set her up for later, as she turns out to be in league with the space pirates, with her player being the ones that the sections of the beacons are being sent to, which given how long the V-ship spends in orbit of it, how none of this was noticed is somewhat strange. I again don't have anything to really say about Madeline either. She's just there for the first few episodes to be talked to and have exposition dumped on. Then later when she's revealed to be in league with the space pirates, she doesn't do anything noteworthy. The only interesting thing about it is that she believes her father, Dom Izagiri, was killed but is in fact a prisoner of the space pirates. The only reason this is interesting is that it gives us a chance to have some sort of emotional connection to Madeline, with her being used basically as a puppet of the pirates, but it goes nowhere with her never reuniting with her father on screen. In fact, her final scene shows her saying it would be nice to see him again, so this potentially emotional moment is non-existent in the serial, which lessens the point of this aspect existing in the first place. Next we have Milo Clancy, who is somewhat memorable, although that's mostly because he's just so out there as a comedy character, with him being a bit out of place against the rest of the cast. This does make him stand out, and he is a complete comedy character, which when set against the extreme boredom of the serial, means that there is something to him even if it's barely anything. We do actually learn a bit about his history, notably that he was previously a business partner of Madeline's father, who unlike Madeline, he actually reunites with. Beyond that, he also owns his own mining company, with his shipments having been raided by the space pirates on their way to his planet. Of course, due to him being around during the events of the serial, he is accused by General Hermack of being the one responsible for all of this. Although since the audience has shown that it's clearly not him, it means that this is just another way of wasting time for the V-ship crew. I will admit Clancy's opening scene is quite funny, as he's just trying to have his breakfast and his ship is both breaking down, while at the same time he's being pestered by the V-ship. Finally onto the main cast, and there's basically nothing to say here. The trio do very little in the serial, with them spending most of their time being captives in some form, with the entirety of episode 2 having them trapped on a segment of a space beacon. This is something Troughton complained about one day when he returned home, according to his son Michael Troughton. The trio don't actually show up until the very end of episode 1, and so this is basically the episode which introduces them, but it doesn't have them interact with anyone else until the very last scene when Clancy arrives, and that's part of a cliffhanger, so they don't really interact. The majority of the episode focuses on the V-ship crew and Clancy, which means we don't get to see much of the trio in it anyway. Things don't even pick up once they escape from the beacon section, because they are soon captured by the space pirates when they arrive on Tar, the planet of the Izagiri Mining Company. From there they spend some time as prisoners before escaping and then becoming prisoners again where they meet Dom, before having to stop an explosion which will kill all of them and destroy the V-ship. That's it for the trio. They don't really have anything notable about them here, with so much time spent as prisoners or trapped in some location. They barely interact with the greater cast, with there being no scenes with them and any members of the V-ship crew, with the exception of Lieutenant Sorba, who was left aboard the beacon they were stranded on, and then later are imprisoned with him on Tar, with him soon being killed by Cavan. This really feels like a story where the trio were bolted onto it at some point, with feeling a lot more like a separate story about the V-ship crew, which became a Doctor Who serial. I will note this one thing though, and that's when the Doctor is trying to open the door of the cave prison, as he uses a tuning fork to try and unlock the audio lock. This is only noteworthy as this is very similar to his first adventure, as in The Power of the Daleks he was trapped in a cell which had the same sort of lock, except instead of a tuning fork he used a glass of water, which could suggest he now carries a tuning fork in case of this event. And I suppose the drawing pins line is quite funny too.
What are you carrying drawing pins for?
I like drawing pins.
But that's about it for the trio in this story. I can't think of anything too notable that any of them do, especially Jamie and Zoe, who feel like they're just sort of there. On the behind the scenes though, we have quite a few things. I'll begin with one of the most interesting, that being the change to the recording studios, as episode 1 would be the final episode of the show to be recorded in Lime Grove Studios, with the small Studio D finally being left behind and the production moving to BBC Television Centre. Then we have episode 2, which was uniquely and oddly recorded directly onto film, which led to it being preserved for its historical significance. Yes, an episode of The Space Pirates was preserved for its historical significance. This had to have been someone having a joke. This would also be the final story overseen by producer Peter Bryant, who would take his leave from the show, to be replaced by ex-script editor Derek Sherwin, who was interestingly script editor for this serial. Finally we have this somewhat interesting fact, as this serial featured an uncredited floor assistant named John Turner, who some may know as JNT. So let's try and end this on a positive note, with one positive thing I have to say about this serial, and that's the score. Despite the lack of visuals and the rather lacking plot, the music by Dudley Simpson is of course great, with the music for the titles and the V-ship being very notable. Plus the few surviving film sequences including model shots are pretty decent, so I guess that's two things. But we all know that this era is just an extreme palate cleanser for what comes next, which we all want to be on right now. The main cast pre-recorded all of their scenes for episode 6, so they could be sent on location filming, and Derek Sherwin returns as script editor for this serial, so that current script editor Terrence Dix could team up with Malcolm Hulke to work on the next serial. So let's get this one over with and get ready for that one. So The Space Pirates is boredom to the extreme. It's not exactly bad, but it's extremely dull. The only worst serials are perhaps The Space Museum and The Underwater Menace, but even those only last 4 episodes. But at least we all know it gets better from here. And I suppose on the one hand you could say, since it's completely missing, it can only get better if it's found. But next time, the TARDIS lands in the middle of a Great War, but not all is as it seems, with anachronisms all over the place and generals who aren't what they seem. But all of this hides a grander threat, which will force the Doctor to face what he has been running from since the beginning. Next time, the War Games.